let's look at another office, another role that Jesus takes. To understand Jesus the King, you got to go back to the kings of Israel. What are Israel's kings? The book of Judges ends with this epitaph on the pre-royal Israel. Everyone did what was right in his or her own mind because there was no king in Israel. It was a set of tribes in a loose confederation, but you couldn't get them to work together. Like that first confederation of American states that happens after the War of Independence. The people cry louder and louder, give us a king like the nations have. We need a king like the nations have. When Samuel hears one of those calls, he goes to God and says, what do I do? And God says, well, Samuel, they haven't rejected you as king. They've rejected me as king. Like they have from the very beginning when I brought them out of Egypt. So given their king, this is in 1 Samuel 8, go and tell them, you're going to get your king, and your king is going to wage wars for his interests, and you're going to be out in front fighting, and he's going to be back behind the lines safely. He's going to tax you into oblivion, and you're going to be his slaves. And you're going to cry out to me on that day when you become the slaves of your king, and I'm not going to deliver you. So go and tell them the good news that they're going to get their wish. And that is the birth of the Israelite monarchy. And Israel's first king is King Saul, who doesn't really work out. King Saul isn't just a temporary aberration, it turns out. King Saul turns out to be a kind of paradigm for Israelite kings. If you look at the whole list of Israelite monarchs, both when the kingdom is united and when it's divided into two, Israel and Judah, they're mainly failures. They all get Fs, with a couple of exceptions. One exception is Josiah, who discovers the covenant after Israel has largely forgotten it and leads a reform which doesn't take, but it restores enough of a consciousness about God and God's covenant that line of thinking survives. Solomon has a mixed record, right? He seeks wisdom, and he lives in Israel's golden age economically and politically. Comes to embody wisdom, but he also comes to embody worldliness, surrender to power. And he is such an ambitious leader that his spending projects end up overtaxing the nation, and under his sons, there's a tax revolt that splits the kingdom. And the other exception, although only a partial exception, is King David. Now, on the one hand, King David has horrible flaws. He commits adultery and murder, and it's not just he who suffers, his whole nation suffers from the trauma of that. His reluctance to discipline leads to a family rebellion against him and an attempted coup by Absalom. His reign is a mess. Right to the end, when he decides, hey, I'm going to see how powerful I am, and holds a census, and God sends a plague just because. No, you still don't get it, do you? So even the bright spots here aren't all that bright. On the other hand, King David embodies something else, which is just right for Israel's king. When he's convicted of his failures, he repents. He hits the deck. And so he has a deeper, fundamental relationship of trust in this God that he keeps messing up in front of. And take heart in that, would you? The Psalms really embody this relationship of trust through and despite failure. He has a heart who goes fully after God. There's an episode, this is in the good years, he's doing pretty well. The king is settled in his palace. The Lord has granted him safety from all the enemies around him. This is in 2 Samuel chapter 7. The king said to the prophet Nathan, "Here I am dwelling in a house of cedar, while the ark of the Lord abides in a tent." This just ain't right. And God answers back, well, A, no, I don't need a house. I don't dwell in houses. And B, you're not the one to build it anyway because you have too much blood on your hands. Your son, who's not a warrior, he'll build my house. So Solomon builds the temple, not David. David's been too busy fighting Philistines. But C is the most interesting item in God's response to David. It's, you're the one who needs a house. And not a house of cedar. I will make you a house that will last forever. A different kind of house, a dynasty. The house of David will last. God promises David a royal line that will last forever. And even a restoration of that line after it's broken. Now, last time when we were talking about the priestly office, I left you with this dilemma that the scriptures of Israel leave us with. When it was priesthood, the dilemma I left you with was, how is it that God requires sacrifices to atone for sins when they can't atone for sins? With respect to the royal office in Israel, the anointed office of the king, the lasting dilemma this really ought to leave us with is it a good thing or a bad thing to have an eternal king when the royal office itself represents a rejection of God as king? If royalty is an embodiment of Israel's failure to trust God, how can it be good for Israel to have a king forever? Already in the prophets, already in the Psalms, you see the beginnings of an answer, the promise of an answer. Israel's coming king will be a different kind of king. Will be a king whose reign isn't subject to the limits and the failings of its earlier kings. I think this dilemma sets the stage for the royal mission of Jesus the King.